So after we did the blog and we had nice conversations with a lot of people about it, we at some point, I can't remember how long afterwards, but we decided that we wanted to make the arguments more formal and to really spell them out in a much more rigorous way. And we had this idea of writing a book and to actually, again, to spell out the arguments, to develop it slowly, carefully. And so we thought about it, we pondered doing it for a while, and then we said, you know what, let's do it. And sure enough, it was a very, very long project. We spent, I don't know, almost 10 years writing a book. And we on and off, we learned Torah a lot, but we also discussed these things a lot. So we went back and forth and back and forth. And we must have written every chapter like a half a dozen times, back and forth, and we passed it. I wrote it, he wrote it, I wrote, and he wrote. And it was kind of we had an interesting dynamic. And as Adam, perhaps you could pick up a little bit, is that oftentimes we have two different styles of, I guess, of teaching and of explaining and of writing. And Aaron's like, would write the, for example, this is oftentimes how things would work. Aaron would write a chapter and he'd write it like very, like, I guess you could say complicated. I would say call it complicated. Maybe he'd call it something else, but it would be like very, complex and maybe esoteric, hard to understand. And then I would take it and I would simplify it and I would kind of, again, I'm by profession. Again, I teach Torah, and I'm a math professor. So and I teach students. I'm a community college, so I teach students who are very weak. And so I guess I have practice in trying to take topics which are hard for students to understand and try to break it down. So again, so I try to simplify it, and then he's making it more complicated. I'm simplifying it, and again, we pass it back and forth and back and forth, and that's kind of the way it was. And we spent a long time on writing this book, and I guess we realized that there's a basic structure to the way we thought to present the argument. So Aaron, you want to talk a little bit about
the three parts to the so basically we realized that you really need three separate parts for this argument to be compelling. The first one is the basic argument, which kind of discussed just now, the argument of fine-tuning, from the mystery to fine-tuning, developing how that points to an intelligent cause for the universe. There happens to be two other separate independent arguments from the qualitative laws of nature and the initial conditions of the universe that all form part one of the book, just showing the solid inference to an intelligent cause. But then for the argument to be compelling, you really have to take up scientist theory of a multiverse. And you have to take it up in detail. You have to take it seriously. You can't just say it's crazy science fiction, because these are some of the smartest people in the world who are saying multiverse. And if you don't take it seriously and really deconstruct it, what their premises are, what their assumptions are, what their evidence is, and ultimately show the real flaw of why it doesn't work in their own framework, you're not really going to convince somebody who's serious. You can convince somebody who's just willing to say that it's just crazy and stupid. And there are people who just intuitively are just going to say, listen, I mean, I'm not going to believe in an infinite number of parallel dimensions and in universes and all these different things. That just sounds crazy. But there are people who take scientists seriously, and I think people you should. There's very intelligent people, and they're not just saying something absolutely crazy. You have to really go into it and see what's wrong with it. That's the second part of our book. It's basically the multiverse. And the third thing is, like we explained before, you have to explain the idea of God. You can't just say God did it. You have to explain, you have to answer the questions, the classic questions people ask against God. What caused God? If God fine-tuned the constants, who fine-tuned God? What does God even mean when you're saying the idea of God? And there's a lot of classic questions that people have against God. And we have a third of our book is devoted to really explain the idea of Yichud Hashem, the idea of, and we did it specifically. It's not based on any religion. It's not based upon authority. It's not based upon, the Rambam says this. It's not the Sajagon. It's not based on anything like that. We're showing through proper philosophical thinking. And we specifically show every one of these categories that people have about God, what caused God. Ultimately, you have to show that God is truly fundamental. He has no cause. We show how scientists in all these categories, scientists use these categories to explain scientific theory. So let's just say for that example, scientists, when they believe, and Stephen Hawking, we show, spells this out in detail, but like where do the laws of nature come from? Well, they just say, look, that is the ultimate base of reality, is the qualitative laws of nature. From quantum mechanics, Stephen Hawking had this theory at one point that, nothing is unstable and the universe has popped into existence. Okay, fine. But not getting into that particular thing. But then you say, where do the laws of nature come from? Where does quantum mechanics come from? That's a reality. That's an uncaused existence, quantum mechanics. It has no deeper cause. That's just a fact of nature. And that's okay. That's the thing wrong with scientists. Everybody's going to have to come back to it at some point where they just say that's the way it is. And that's just one example. We show that scientists have this idea of a fundamental uncaused existence. They just hold it's a complex physics equation as opposed to one simple God. But we show through all the categories of Yichud Hashem, how God is one, how he's unique, how he's simple, how he has no cause, and go by one how these concepts answer all the questions atheists have against God. We make it rigorous and compelling and coherent, and we bring in examples from physics and all these advanced categories that physicists use nowadays, and show how those same categories apply in terms of the human mind to thinking about God. And we're not just creating categories. These are the categories of thought that scientists use when they're explaining fundamental existences, and therefore it's the appropriate method of thought for dealing with a fundamental existence like God. And that's something we do in the third part, which we devote to Yichud Hashem.
Okay, so the Yichud Hashem aspect, I'm actually curious because, I remember years ago, I was reading, for whatever reason, I was like in a Chabad, and they had these these Tanachs or these Chamisha Chumshei Torah of Rabbi Berg, the Kabbalah Center, and I opened it up and I see Michio Kaku, famous, I don't think he's a physicist. So he's writing about, how he's comparing kind of like the sphero to the, to the string theory. It was very strange, whatever it is, but I think that it made me think right now, what you just said is that a lot of Jews have maybe a misunderstanding of what God is. And maybe I think the Maimonidean approach actually solves a lot of the issues. In our episode that we did earlier with Rabbi Maruf on Spinoza and atheism, he actually pointed this out. He said, if everybody just understood the Maimonidean model of God and the universe, we wouldn't have any of these issues. So maybe you can expand on that idea. Well,
I'll tell you on a personal level. So when I was younger, so I loved the Rambam, the Moreh Nevuchim. It was, eye-opening. It changed my life, showed me a rational approach to Judaism. But at some point, and I was a little disenchanted by the Rambam. And I came back to my love of the Rambam, okay? But there was a period in my life where I got very frustrated with the Rambam because the Rambam, and again, no fault of his own, it's just the Moreh Nevuchim, even the Mishnah Torah, it's intermingled his whole system with Aristotelian physics. And it's very difficult to like, for example, the active intellect. It plays such a prominent role in the Rambam's philosophy and how he explains certain things that it becomes very difficult. How do you disengage? So I didn't believe in the active intellect. It didn't make sense. The whole category of active intellect didn't really make sense to me. I'm going to try to explain how the Rambam thinks about Aristotle, thought about it. But it became very difficult for me to cut out from the Rambam Aristotelian physics and to keep what remained. I wasn't able to do that. This was in my early 20s. I couldn't do that. I kind of left the Rambam aside for maybe maybe even a decade or so. I was involved in the Ramban and Rashi. And eventually I came back to the Rambam, and it really was, I needed more modern physics, which is kind of interesting, is I really needed to understand modern science better. And I needed to understand the Rambam better. My mind had to develop. I had to, learn more Gemara, really, which is a funny idea for this. But, the learning Gemara through the Brisker Method, it really helped train my mind to think categorically. And what I set out to do was to try to see what from the Rambam, what about his philosophy still works nowadays, still is very good. And, what ideas are just tied to Aristotle and don't really work anymore. And to try to reformulate the Rambam, the core ideas of the Rambam that are necessary for Yichud Hashem, how he thinks about the eternity of the universe, prophecy, different types of things. Again, we don't discuss prophecy on our podcast. Again, but we will at some point discuss the question of the eternity of the universe. I think that comes up in the third mini-series about God, interestingly enough. But the idea was to really be able to formulate the Rambam in a framework of modern physics. And we do that. That's really this third part about God and Yichud Hashem. It's not exactly the Rambam, but very close to it, but in the context of modern physics, without any of the Aristotelian science. And that's what's I think is really interesting about that third mini-series, is having these ideas from our Masorah, but formulating in the context of modern physics without having any of the ancient physics, which isn't really correct anymore.
Yeah, and I think it's very clear that Rambam would want you to do that, that not to stick to an old, outdated science. So I actually think, what our listeners should get out of this is that this is so important. No one else is doing this, and what you guys are doing is really groundbreaking and very exciting. We're very excited about it because now we want to, talk about what you guys are doing, which is the podcast, Physics to God. How did you get this idea of making a podcast?
Okay, good idea. Good question. So we spent a long time on writing our book, as I mentioned, and we wanted the book, I guess, to be rigorous. We wanted to make an argument and not just to wave our hands and say this shows God, but we wanted to really spell out the argument as clear and as thoroughly as possible and to take up all the questions. And by the time we were done, we realized that it was like too rigorous, too dense for a layman, if you will. And we wanted to reach your average person. We didn't think these ideas are so sophisticated and so hard and so out of the reach of people. But because we wanted to be thorough and rigorous, we ended up writing it in a way that was too hard for people to read, and it was too dense. And we thought that we put so much time into getting these ideas clear. We just felt we needed a different medium, a different way to convey these ideas in a way that could reach the plain person. And that's what ended up happening. Is we thought, someone mentioned us the idea of, why don't we try to make a podcast? Podcasts are all the thing these days. And we have a lot of experience teaching and trying to explain things to people and breaking it down and simplifying it. And again, we both are involved in teaching Torah, and then I teach math, and so we just thought it would be a good idea is to try to take the same ideas which we spent developing and using, trying to present them into bite-sized pieces, into making a podcast, and to breaking them down, and to simplifying, and to coming up with analogies, and to presenting it in a way that really would talk to people we try to make it a little more entertaining, try to be more friendly, we try to give examples. Again, that's the ideas. We thought this was going to be a better forum to be able to reach people. And I think hopefully, again, when we try to look into a book, is like oftentimes you need to build an audience where people would be interested in the book. And we thought this is, again, we still think the book will have a great place, and it's a more rigorous, full presentation of the ideas. But at the same time, we think these ideas could be understood and appreciated by people as long as we're able to simplify it. And that's kind of the ideas we decided to make take the 3 parts of our book and make it into 3 separate mini-series. And basically, we're making a podcast. And so far, we've released 4 episodes so far. And each of these are going to have 3 mini-series, each of which is going to be approximately 10 episodes. And we're basically going to be trying to take the listeners to be able to go through the process, through step by step, and develop, leading to present these ideas. I
think the animations were a great touch.
Yeah, so that's what. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm saying
so that's what we thought.
We need to get to bigger, wider audiences.
Yeah, that's what we were advised by people. Is, again, this is a part of the problem, is that people are afraid of physics and are afraid of math. Again, I teach students. I just know people. I even tell people I'm a math major. I'm a math guy, and I often see people's face. They like shriek and they tilt back, and people have a fear of math, and physics is probably even more so. It just sounds scary. It sounds hard. And we think that these ideas are not that hard. Of course, they're difficult, and a person has to be willing to think. But at the same time, we are trying to reach a person who doesn't have a background in math or in strong background in math or science. And that's what we're trying to make it more entertaining. We also have YouTube videos, which are animated. And again, we're trying to lighten up the tone, because we do think that, again, we don't want to scare anybody off. And the book was very intense, and we're trying to, again, make it more friendly, more user-friendly to be able to appeal to people who are, who just give it a chance and who are going to take the ideas. And if so far we've received a lot of good feedback and people are liking it. And it's, again, the ideas are hopefully being presented in a way which is going to, slowly work through the ideas.
Amazing. And what, values does your podcast have for a religious person?
So, I mean, I'm assuming you mean like in the context of a religious person, not just somebody who wants to believe in God, but I mean like somebody like in terms of the Torah, things like that. And like, so we kind of get that question a lot about people who are really, they're concerned about divine providence. How do you prove the Torah? How do I know there's hashgacha pratis that relates to me? And, is our podcast going to take that up? So, we don't know, we might eventually get to those topics. Right now, we're planning on converting the book into the podcast form. And it's not a religious, it's not specifically for a religious audience. It's for religious and a non-religious audience. But I do think still the idea of God and the ideas on the podcast have a tremendous significance for a religious person. Besides for the fact that God is obviously the foundation of any religion. And one of the ways to know God is by studying his wisdom that's in the creation that leads you to the love of God. But also this conflict that exists between religion and the modern world, where, a lot of people, especially in the modern Orthodox community, Jews, and I'm assuming other religions. I don't know, but I don't know them on a personal level. But there's this conflict that comes from the fact that our society really esteems scientists, and it values science and philosophy and the secular knowledge, and there's this tremendous regard that people have for scientists. But then every kid in high school, modern Orthodox high school, knows that scientists are atheists. They don't believe in God. And scientists don't believe that the Torah is true, and they don't believe in miracles. They don't believe in hashgacha pratis. And, a lot of these kids have, like, I'm not saying everybody, some kids just say faith and they're happy with that and they go on their way. And that's, we're not speaking to those kids. That's not really the target of our audience, but our target audience. But there are a lot of people who have this trouble with the fact that the secular, philosophical, respected scientific world doesn't believe in the Torah. And I think when a person we'll go through the podcast, go through the 3 different mini-series, and they start to realize that they could see with their own mind that there is a good, strong argument here that's convincing. Scientists hear that, but they end up saying multiverse, which is this infinite number of unobservable realities, completely different. Scientists discuss changing the scientific method to accommodate the multiverse. And then they see that the questions that scientists ask about God, about Yichud Hashem, there actually are good explanations for it that are not outdated and ancient, but work within a context of modern philosophy and modern science. That, I think, will give a modern Orthodox person the confidence to say, just like scientists were wrong about God, I can see that God exists with my own mind from science. And these scientists are just making things, I don't want to say making things up, it's too harsh, but these scientists are denying the idea of Yichud Hashem. Maybe perhaps the scientists don't fully appreciate what Yichud Hashem means, and they're positing infinite numbers of universes, maybe just like they're wrong about that. And hopefully the listener will be able to have firsthand knowledge why the scientists are wrong about this, wrong about God's existence. That will give a person confidence to say, maybe these scientists are wrong about the Torah. Maybe they're wrong about these other things. And I shouldn't just accept the fact that scientists reject the Torah. I should have to look into this with my own mind, and don't just have these guys in this high regard and esteem, and they must be right. These guys are the ones who are believing in infinite number of parallel universe that nobody can observe. And that I think really can give a person confidence that just like scientists are wrong about God, they're wrong about the Torah also.
Right. I'd like to add another point is that, the Rambam talks about that Avas Hashem often could come from when a person sees the great chachma in the universe, the great wisdom in all the different facets of the universe. And we really are trying to make this podcast in a way that, besides being an argument for God, explains the science, explains the different facets of our universe, breaks down the science, and allows you to really appreciate the chachma which is implicit in our universe, to see how the laws work together, how God fine-tuned the constants to be able to yield our unbelievable, amazing universe. And through seeing this, it really gives a person, even if a person already says, look, I already know God is true and I don't have any problems, but still, you could see the Chachmas Hashem. It gives you like a firsthand window into of course, on a basic level, but you get to see the different facets of the Chachmas Hashem, which is built in the universe. And I think through seeing that, it could really lead a person to Ahavas Hashem, to truly have an appreciation for the wonder in creation.
Of course, there's a lot of inspiration to get from understanding these things. So before we go, first of all, we want to thank you for making the time, and this was really amazing. And we wanted to just ask you where people can find the podcast.
Yeah, so you can find it on Spotify, Apple, Google, Stitcher, wherever you find your podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts. You could also get it on YouTube. We're slowly making an animated version of it. That's Physics to God. You can search. Also, our website is physicstogod.com, and that has links to all the different platforms. And we plan, again, our basic plan is to be releasing the podcast. We just released episode 4 tonight after Shabbos, and I think our plan is to release another episode, at least through the first mini-series, release every other week or so. So also, if you want to discuss, if you have questions, again, we'd love this to be interactive. If anyone has questions, we could post on our website. We have a forum, we have a YouTube group, we have a Facebook group, Physics to God, and we'd love to, get a conversation going. And we want to teach people. We're here to be able to explain these ideas, not just to present them, but to be able to have feedback and get people involved in the conversation. And again, we'd love to reach people at their level and take up whatever questions people have. So, thanks so much. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to talk and to, spread the message and teach, try to get these ideas out there.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much. Great to meet you.
Sure.
Yeah, you two guys, we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Okay. Shavua tov.
So,
What